Welcome to Exercise 17, the reproductive system. Boy parts, girl parts, embarrassing pictures. Yeah, that's Exercise 17. As usual, be sure to turn up your volume if you haven't already. Exercise 17 starts on page 169. There's still the instructional objectives that I still wasn't going over. There is a little bit of an introduction at the bottom, and they say, with us humans, as all other critters, the most important contribution we make to the species is the offspring we leave behind. These offspring will produce more offspring, who will produce more offspring, and overpopulate the planet. Oh, that wasn't quite what it said. Yeah, well, we will ensure the continuation of our species. Although each child is a precious and unique entity, every child is the result of a highly complex, efficient reproductive process common to us all that is rather complicated. On this chapter, we're going to be focusing on boy parts and girl parts, but other chapters between 1408 and 1409 would talk about meiosis and producing the gametes. Exercise 18 that we may or may not be doing this semester will be talking about how a sperm meets up with the egg. The little cells would have to do mitosis from 1408, and you'd have to try out all your genetics and do DNA and RNA and protein synthesis. My God, that's about half a class right there. It is actually a very complex process to get from boy meets girl to having a baby there. It is a lot of complex stuff, but for this semester, we're just going to be talking about reproduction, boy parts and girl parts right now. You are going to need to know several figures and a bunch of slides and some other stuff, but we'll go ahead and turn the page and start in with that other stuff. On page 170, the lab book starts talking about the male reproductive system and how it starts with the paired testes, which do produce sperm. There are some other assorted body parts. That's nice. Spermatogenesis is the process of sperm production. We'll talk more about that soon, but spermatogenesis makes sperm, just like its name says. Every now and then I have a bad habit of asking a question on a lecture exam. Spermatogenesis makes blank? Sperm, just like its name says. I worry a little bit about the students who put eggs in there. Yeah, well. Spermatogenesis does take place in the seminiferous tubules. We're supposed to look at a seminiferous tubule or testes slide underneath the microscope. We would locate one of the round tubules in cross-section. Notice the round thing on the slide here. The outer layer of cells is the spermatogonia. You can just kind of imagine the outer layer there that's a little darker with the cells. Those are going to be the spermatogonia. Those are going to be the cells that divide by mitosis. Okay, you might have repressed memories of mitosis from biology 1408, but one cell gets bigger and splits into two identical cells. One of those cells is going to undergo meiosis and actually make sperm. The second cell is going to stay there and be a spermatogonia. That way it can divide into two. One cell can start making sperm, and one cell can always make more cells that'll make sperm. It's a little weird, but if the spermatogonia made sperm itself, then it'd go away and there wouldn't be another one to make more sperm tomorrow. Oh, so it splits into two cells. One of them is free to make sperm, and one of them is free to make more cells. The cell that does start making sperm is going to be the primary spermatocyte. It'll technically undergo meiosis 1. Oh no, probably more repressed memories from 1408. Meiosis was the harder thing, and we duplicated chromosomes, we divided in half, and then we divided in half again, so we ended up with 4 haploid cells. 4 cells that had 1 copy of each chromosome. Well, the primary spermatocyte is the one that does the first division. It's kind of the next layer. It's a little hard to tell on my picture where exactly it starts and stops, but it's kind of the next layer there. When the primary spermatocyte divides, it makes 2 secondary spermatocytes. Those are the ones that are actually going to do the second round of meiosis. Meiosis 2. They'll become 4 spermatids. You put the right pieces on it, and you call it sperm eventually. Oh my God, Miss Snaples, how on earth can you put that on a lab practical? Well, I could just put arrows where they're pointing about right now, but honestly, what we do is we put a slide out and ask you if this, identify this slide A. Seminiferous tubules, B. Corpus luteum, C. Graphian follicle, D. Some other dumb answer. Yeah, as long as you recognize the picture is seminiferous tubules, we're fine. I don't really ask which cell is the spermatogonian, which one's the primary spermatocyte, and all that, but the lab book did say to draw and label a seminiferous tubule as seen under the microscope, so there you go, it's at least labeled. There is one other structure that's going to be on the next slide, so be sure to click that one. The round thing in the middle was the seminiferous tubules, and you can see the sides, the arcs of several of the other round seminiferous tubules in this picture as well. But in between the seminiferous tubules are the interstitial cells. These are the actual cells that produce testosterone. They are found in the testes and specifically between the seminiferous tubules. They are the specific cell type that produces testosterone. A lot of times, especially for non-science majors, we say that the testes produces testosterone. And remember, we are inside the testes. These are the specific cells that do produce the testosterone. The inter in interstitial cells refers to between. Stitial? I don't know, but it's between the seminiferous tubules. We will need to be able to identify the parts of the sperm. First of all, on the far right side of the sperm is the head of the sperm. That does have the haploid DNA. I wasn't going to go back into haploid versus diploid. We'll save that for lecture. But haploid is 1 copy of every chromosome. Diploid's going to be 2 copies of every chromosome. Us humans, we are diploid. We've got 2 copies of every chromosome. 1 copy comes from the sperm and 1 copy comes from the egg. That makes our 2 copies that we're supposed to have in the baby. But there'd be 1 copy haploid DNA in the head of the sperm. On the outside of the head of the sperm is the acrosome. The acrosome has enzymes to allow the sperm to penetrate and enter the egg. When we talk about the development chapter, we'll see that the egg does have a layer of cells around the outside. The corona radiata. No, it's not a beer. But it does have a layer of cells around the outside. When the sperm get close, they release the enzymes from their acrosome and actually eat through the cell layer. That does allow the next sperm to enter the egg. The next section that we're going to talk about is the mid-piece. It does have mitochondria for energy. Remember from 1408, mitochondria were the powerhouse of the cell? That's because they make the power, they make the ATP, they make the energy. When we start talking about the little sperm, he is going to have to swim through the female reproductive tract. Now, 4 or 5 inches may not be a lot for you and I, but for a little itty-bitty teeny-tiny microscopic sperm, that's a long way. And he's going to need a lot of energy so that he can swim through the female reproductive tract. The mid-piece has the mitochondria, so the sperm can make their own energy, and they'll have their own power plant. The flagella would be the tail for movement. Okay, technically it's 1 flagellum and 2 flagella, but usually most sperm, if you're talking about plural sperm, there's a lot of them. There's 60 million of them per ejaculate, so there's a lot of flagella, would be some tails for movement. And really, to make the sperm in the seminiferous tubules, we'd be doing spermatogenesis, which makes sperm. Under the microscope, sperm would be really, really, really small. With our microscopes in lab, it's even smaller than this picture. This picture was taken with a slightly better microscope than we've got in our lab, and certainly a better microscope than you've got at home. Yeah, well. The little black dots are going to be the heads of the sperms. Just behind the head of the sperm, there's a slightly darker little itty-bitty teeny part of the line. That would be the mid-piece, the expanded portion with the mitochondria. And then the little 3 or 4 inch tail would be the flagella, obviously. If you look around on here, you can see some abnormalities. One of the sperms in the middle does have a kinked tail. There's a couple of them that look like they've got a really small head. One of the ones up at the top is really kind of funky shaped, too. There's a couple of places where it might look like there's some 2-headed sperms. Actually, there's probably just 2 sperms sitting right on top of each other or very close to each other. I didn't see anything that I really thought was two-headed sperm on this picture, but yeah, most male infertility is caused by low numbers of sperm or some anatomy problems with the sperm. Oh my God, Miss Snaples, I can't even identify half of what you're talking about there. Yeah, I know. Honestly, on the lab practical, we put the picture out and ask you to identify this slide. A, seminiferous tubules, B, sperm, C, corpus luteum, D, Graafian follicle. This happens to be B, sperm. If I'm going to ask you to identify the parts and the pieces, I'd ask you on the last picture. On page 172 is figure 17.1, the male reproductive structures. Figure 17.1 isn't labeled, so you'll want to spend a few minutes labeling the appropriate structures. The numbers on the PowerPoint slide just refer to the line numbers, so the first line number on the left-hand side is the vas deferens, and the sixth line on the right-hand side points to the testes. Again, label them for a few minutes, and then we'll move on to more slides that talk about the individual structures in more detail. We're going to be looking at the structures on figure 17.1 in the order that sperm is produced, so we're not really going to start at the top left side. We'll actually start at the testes, which does make sperm. Sadly, on this PowerPoint it's at the bottom, but we're just going to have to deal with that. The testes is the general structure that makes sperm. It is enclosed in the scrotum, and there would be the seminiferous tubules on the very inside that actually make the sperm. Once the sperm is made in the testes, they'll go to the epididymis. The epididymis stores sperm and motility increases. The sperm are generally stored in the epididymis where they spend some time maturing. They'll spend 40-45 days in the epididymis, and their motility increases. We've already made the sperm with their flagella, but at this point they're starting to learn how to use that flagella and figure out if they can actually swim, so their motility will increase. From there, the epididymis hooks directly into the vas deferens, or the ductus deferens is its other name. The vas deferens takes sperm from the epididymis to the urethra. You might notice it's going from the very bottom of the testes up and around a hip bone, around the bladder, and comes in and hooks on the backside of what will be the prostate gland. Hooks into the urethra back there, and then the urethra is going to go from the bladder out. There is somewhere about halfway on the model, halfway between the vas deferens and the epididymis, there's kind of a number 3 there. Isn't there a little bit of a shortcut out? Yeah, there's a little bit of a shortcut out. I really shouldn't talk about guys not being able to ask for directions. Oh, I'm going to get in trouble for that one of these days. No, it's not that guys can't ask for directions. The trick is the embryo does start out with primordial gonads that are up in the abdominal pelvic cavity. When the little embryo decides it's going to be a boy and starts turning on all the boy parts, the testes have to descend from in the abdominal pelvic cavity down past the pelvic cavity to the outside of the body. So the testes really did start way up at the top of the page, maybe even above your monitor, and they'd have to descend down to their rightful location. It's not that somebody took a shortcut that wasn't a shortcut. Yeah, there might be a better way to hook things in, but the way the little embryo develops actually does have a little kink in the plumbing there. That's fine. There's a longer vas deferens than really ought to be necessary, but that's just kind of the way things are. The vas deferens comes up and around the bladder and meets up behind the bladder with the seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicle, there are actually 2 seminal vesicles. There's one on the right side of the model that's shown here, and there would be one on the left side of the model or human, which has been removed in this picture, but there would be a second seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicles, what they do is they add fructose. Turns out semen is sperm plus secretions from the epididymis, the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the Cowper's gland. Ultimately, most of the extra fluid does come from the seminal vesicles. 60 to 70% of the extra fluid comes from the seminal vesicles. And what that extra fluid from the seminal vesicle does is it adds fructose. Okay, you may have repressed memories of metabolism from 1408, but Remember there was glycolysis that converted glucose into 2 pyruvates that went in the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain and ultimately made energy? We generally make the energy from glucose. Fructose would be a cousin to the glucose. It's another sugar. And so basically what we're doing is we're feeding the sperm. The seminal vesicle adds fructose to feed the sperm so that they can make energy from their midpiece and use the flagella to swim through the female reproductive tract. The ejaculatory duct is where the vas deferens joins up with the seminal vesicle. The ejaculatory duct isn't quite as fun as the name makes it out to be. Really, the trick is with anatomy. Yeah, I know I mentioned anatomy again. But the trick with anatomy is wherever you've got two things, like the vas deferens and the seminal vesicles, wherever they come together to make a third structure, the third structure has to have a name. That would be our ejaculatory duct. It's simply where the vas deferens joins up with the seminal vesicle. In real life, that's about 3/4 of an inch. Most of that ejaculatory duct is in our next structure, the prostate gland. You'll have to click to the next slide to find out more about the prostate gland. Just underneath the bladder is the prostate gland, which completely surrounds the urethra. It also secretes citrate. That's one of the fluids in the semen there. And the citrate is a little harder to explain than the fructose, but basically the citrate is going to be one of the active ingredients, one of the first chemicals in the Krebs cycle, which was producing a lot of ATP. So the mitochondria can make a bunch of energy so the sperm can swim through the female reproductive tract. Basically, we're feeding the sperm again. Instead of feeding them pure sugar like we were from the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland is going to secrete some other food source called citrate. One of the key things on the prostate gland is the urethra is going to run directly through the prostate gland. And anything that enlarges the size of the prostate gland probably pushes down on the urethra. Now, the urethra, we'll see soon, is going to take urine from the bladder and sperm coming from the vas deferens through the prostate gland and out through the penis. So if the prostate gland is pushing down on the urethra, urine's not going to get through and sperm's not going to get through. That's going to be a bit of a problem. So sometimes they might have to do a prostate removal surgery. Generally, if you remove the prostate gland, there's really not too many problems, assuming the surgery goes correctly. The testes is still there making sperm. The interstitial cells are still between the seminiferous tubules, and they're still making the testosterone. They're still in the testes as well. So sperm's still being made, testosterone is still being made. Okay, if you remove the prostate gland, you are removing a little bit of the food supply. So you put your sperm on a diet plan. That's about the extent of it. If you didn't need Viagra before the prostate removal surgery, you shouldn't need Viagra after the prostate removal surgery. Now, I have to admit, if something does go hideously wrong and you slice into the wrong body part there, that might be a little more of a problem. There might be an issue there. But generally, just removal of the prostate gland shouldn't cause any reproductive problems. Our next structure is the Cowper's gland, or the bulbourethral gland. It secretes an alkaline fluid that, rather than feeding the sperm, turns out it provides the sperm with a little bit of protection. The female vagina is rather acidic, and the Cowper's gland will secrete an alkaline fluid. Alkaline? That would be a basic fluid, so it's going to neutralize the acidity of the vagina. So we've got our own Tums and Rolaids. The sperm have their own Tums or Rolaids in the Cowper's gland, secreting the alkaline fluid there. We said in the urinary system that the bladder stores urine. It still does that. Why are we talking about the bladder in the reproductive system? Well, partially because it's right there in the middle of all the other organs. Partially because we're going to have to talk about the urethra anyway. The bladder does still store urine. That's nice. The urethra is still the tube that takes urine from the bladder out, but it does run through a whole bunch of reproductive parts. So the urethra will take urine from the bladder out, but also that vas deferens, seminal vesicle, ejaculatory duct, etc. is all going to meet up with that urethra as well, so it will take sperm from, well, the vas deferens out. Okay, fine, we'll take urine and sperm out of the body. The urethra is shown in two spots on this picture. That's because there is one running just below the prostate gland. It does continue on through boy parts there, through the penis. That's nice. And then we get to embarrassing parts. The corpus spongiosum and corpus cavernosum are both erectile tissue. In the penis, the erectile tissue does fill with blood and the penis becomes erect. Yeah, that sort of thing. The corpus spongiosum is the erectile tissue directly surrounding the urethra. The urethra is that little brown line running through the center that was carrying the urine and the sperm. The corpus spongiosum directly surrounds that. Technically, the corpus spongiosum is a single piece of erectile tissue. It looks like there's two of them in this picture because we've got a little bit of a cutaway section, but it really is just a single piece of erectile tissue. The corpus cavernosum is the erectile tissue in the front side of the penis. Technically, the corpus cavernosa is actually two pieces of erectile tissue, which is a little weird because only one of them showing up in this model. Go figure. Yeah, well, the corpus spongiosum directly surrounds the urethra, and the corpus cavernosa would be the paired erectile tissue on the front side of the penis. The glans penis is the expanded portion of the penis, or the head of the penis. Yeah, that part. The prepuce is the foreskin, or the flap of tissue that does cover the glans penis. The lab book talks about a surgery called circumcision, where sometimes that prepuce has been removed. In this country, a lot of males do have the prepuce or foreskin surgically removed right around birth. Be advised, on a lot of our models, the prepuce or foreskin is still there, so that we can see some of the anatomical features. One of my students once told me that he did not look like the model. Guys, you may not look like the model. Most of our models are uncircumcised, and many American males are circumcised. If you don't look quite exactly like the model, please don't let us know. Just keep that to yourself. That's fine. Ladies, you might not look like our models either. Not to put too fine of a point on it, you'll probably never notice it because it's an online class, but several of our models in the lab have been damaged, and I hope you don't have a hole in your uterus either. Yeah, well, sometimes you may not look exactly precisely like the models. That's it for boy parts. On page 172, second paragraph, the female reproductive system starts with the paired ovaries, which are the site of gamete production. The female gamete is the oocyte or egg. Like the testes, the ovaries are surrounded by some stuff that we don't really need to know about. We're supposed to look at a slide of a cat ovary in cross-section. Embedded in the connective tissue of the ovary are tiny, numerous sac-like structures called follicles. Each follicle is going to contain an oocyte or egg. There are going to be numerous small primary follicles that have 1 to 2 layers of cells surrounding the oocyte. On the very bottom left corner of this picture, you can see 4, 5, or 6 maybe primary follicles that would just be a little round thing, 1 to 2 layers of cells surrounding the oocyte. Medium-sized developing follicles would have a small fluid-filled space between the oocyte and the surrounding cells. Hang on, we'll see those eventually. The biggest follicles are the mature Graafian follicles, which are being shown in this picture. The big thing on the right is a very mature Graafian follicle. The kind of well, let's not call it medium-sized. The large, rather than extra large, thing on the left is going to be a smaller Graafian follicle, and then that extra large thing on the right is still a much later Graafian follicle there. Note both the follicles do have the oocyte, round thing in the center, that is positioned on a stalk of cells. So we are looking at the Graafian follicles. I usually talk about seeing a Small round thing inside a bigger round thing. Yep, that would be a Graafian follicle. By the way, these are part of oogenesis, which is going to make eggs. Spermatogenesis earlier made sperm. Oogenesis makes oos, not OOs. Oogenesis makes oocytes, which are eggs. For a fill-in-the-blank type of question, oogenesis makes eggs. Feel free to just put eggs on a lecture exam. On a half exam, it'd be multiple choice, so it's not that bad of a deal. If we are doing the development section, be careful looking at things with an O in the front. We'll also talk about organogenesis that makes organs, not necessarily eggs. Try not to get the two confused. Each month, one of those Graafian follicles ruptures and releases the oocyte in a process called ovulation. Once the egg has been ovulated or released from the Graafian follicle, things start deteriorating. The corpus luteum is a large, empty follicle after the egg is ruptured from the follicle. What we've really got here is a round thing with no round thing in the center. Where the two black arrows are pointing would be the corpus luteums. There happens to be two of them in this picture. Directly above each of them would be two Graafian follicles. Notice the round thing with the little round things on the center. Yeah, well, there would actually be several different types of follicles on this slide. There's the corpus luteum where the arrows are pointing. There's the Graafian follicle on top of that. And kind of underneath the corpus luteums, there's some of those medium-sized developing follicles. And then those little bitty teeny tiny round things, those are probably some of the primary follicles. So you can actually see a lot of different stages in this slide. And that's the way things really are. There would be some primary follicles that would be developing into developing follicles, and then maturing into the Graafian follicles, and then deteriorating into the corpus luteums. So in any given ovary, you would actually see a lot of different stages. Figure 17.2 on page 173 is an ovary. Yeah, I know what it looks like if you look at it sideways. It's not a boob, it's an ovary. The ovary does have all the different stages of follicle development. The first line on the left-hand side does point to some of the small wagon wheel primary follicles. You'll need to look in your book to see where the line's actually pointing to. That way I didn't have to mess things up too badly. But the first line is pointing to several of the primary follicles. The second line on the left-hand side is pointing to 3 developing follicles. Note they're a little bigger, and you can see the actual oocyte in the center. Alright, it's a little black dot, but you can see the oocyte in the center. On the bottom right-hand side, there is a Graafian follicle. Really, is that a nipple? That is not a nipple. The thing that's coming off the side there is an oocyte that's in the process of ovulating. Really, that oocyte for a Graafian follicle should be a little farther up in this picture, but our model is trying to show that the oocyte does actually leave the building. The oocyte is in the process of ovulating. So it's a really late Graafian follicle there that the second line on the right-hand side is pointing to. The first line on the right-hand side would be the corpus luteum. The egg has left the building, and it's a little further along in the deterioration stage rather than the slides that we were just looking at where once the oocyte has left the building, you just have a little round thing. But that corpus luteum does start deteriorating after that. Our model does show the deterioration being more prominent than our slides did. That's fine. That would be at the corpus luteum on the upper right-hand side. Figure 17.3 on page 174 is the female reproductive structures. You'll probably want to go ahead and spend some time labeling these, and then like the boy parts, we'll go ahead and start at the ovary and work our way through where the egg would go to, not necessarily just down the left side of the page here. But we'll be talking about the structures in just a second. The female reproductive system does start with the ovary. kind of the same sort of structure as the testes, making the sperm. The ovary does make oocytes, follicles, eggs, however you want to say it. The ovary is going to make the eggs. It is going to have those follicles that were primary follicles, developing follicles, Graafian follicles, release the egg in the oocyte, and then we deteriorate down to the corpus luteum. But we are starting to make eggs in there. The eggs are made in the ovary and released through the process of ovulation. The fallopian tube's job is to take the egg from the ovary to the uterus, to the next structure that we haven't talked about yet. The fallopian tube, or uterine tube, or oviduct, yeah, another case where we've got multiple names for the same structure. We're non-science majors, so we're going to go with fallopian tube. Does take the egg from the ovary to the uterus. The fallopian tube, we did say over and over and over, the fallopian tube takes the egg from the ovary to the uterus. The problem is the fallopian tube is not directly connected to the ovary. So part of the fallopian tube is called the fimbriae, and it draws the egg into the fallopian tubes. It's some finger-like projections. Fimbriae? Finger? Okay, it doesn't really look the same and it doesn't really sound the same, but it almost looks like teeny tiny little fingers there. Just, about 20 of them. That's a little gross. But the fimbriae draws the egg into the fallopian tubes. It'll actually set up a little bit of a current, and it's rather stupid, but I just picture the fimbriae going, "Over here, little eggy, come this way," and putting out some candy and, luring it into the van of the fallopian tube. But you do have to draw the egg into the fallopian tube so that it can go where it needs to. Oh my God, Miss Snaples, what happens if the egg goes the wrong way and gets fertilized up by the stomach? It is technically possible for the egg to go the wrong direction. However, the fimbriae are pretty good about drawing the egg into the fallopian tube, so it does go in the correct direction. But what if it doesn't? Okay, if the egg gets out, goes for a hike, and gets up by the stomach or something, it's very unlikely for the sperm to meet up with the egg at that point. Honestly, out of 60 million sperm in one ejaculate, generally they figure only 100, maybe 1,000 sperm actually meet up with the egg in its rightful location. So if the egg has gotten up and taken a hike up by the stomach, odds are the sperm's not going to meet up with the egg there. Odds are there's not enough tissue, endometrium, that we haven't talked about. There's not enough uterine tissue up there to actually have a pregnancy or anything. I'm not technically ruling it out. As sure as I say it'll never happen, it'll be in the news tomorrow, but it's astronomically unlikely. Ladies, don't worry about an egg getting fertilized up by the stomach. We've all got better things to worry about. We drive on Dallas-Fort Worth highways or wherever you drive at, and yeah, that's probably dangerous enough. We've got better things to worry about. For the most part, the fimbriae draws the egg into the fallopian tubes, and it's fertilized where it's supposed to be. Where it's supposed to be, by the way, is in the uterine tube. When the sperm meets up with the egg in the fallopian tube, it does have about a week to get down to the uterus. The uterus would be the site of fetal development. That's where the baby's going to be matured and develop, is inside the uterus. The uterus does have several parts, pieces, layers to it, etc. The endometrium is the innermost section of the uterus. That's the one that thickens in preparation for pregnancy. If the sperm meets up with the egg, the endometrium will thicken even further, the placenta will attach, and that's where you have the site of fetal development. But if, oh my gosh, the sperm does not meet up with the egg, then the endometrium is lost in menstruation. Yeah, ladies, that's the gross stuff in the period. It would be the endometrium, that innermost layer that's lost in menstruation. P.S. If you are pregnant, that endometrium does thicken for pregnancy. Once the baby's born, that thickened endometrium has to be lost after the baby's born as well. You get about 9 months of period, all in about 6 weeks. Ew, gross. Yeah, well, I hope it doesn't come as a shock to anybody, but yeah, that endometrium is either going to be lost in menstruation or it is lost after the birth of the baby as well. The myometrium would be the middle layer of the uterus, and it's the muscle layer. Myo is going to be code for muscle. And that myometrium is the one 8.5, 9 months along in pregnancy, you start getting a couple of labor contractions. That's some muscle contractions of the myometrium, so that you get a few contractions and harder and harder and harder contractions until the baby's born. Presumably, if that endometrium is lost in menstruation, the myometrium is probably doing some small muscle cramping. Yeah, that would be the cramps during the period, comes from the myometrium. Not shown on this picture, or in figure 17.3, is the perimetrium. Peri would be around, and it would be a thin outermost layer around the outside of the uterus. But it's not shown on the picture, so never mind, we're not worried about that. Although, if you're taking my lecture section, you do need to worry about it there. The last part of the uterus that we need to worry about is the cervix, which is the neck or the opening of the uterus. There is actually, if there's a baby in there, you'll get a cervical blockage so that the baby doesn't fall out. Yeah, well, honestly, ladies, don't worry about that too much. Think about how many muscle contractions it takes for the baby to actually be born. Yeah, well, the cervix will actually close down quite a bit so that the baby doesn't accidentally fall out. But the cervix would be the neck or the opening to the uterus. The next structure is the vagina, which, according to one of the textbooks I used to teach out of, the vagina receives the male copulatory organ. I've had a couple of students who have had to ask, huh? What? Insert penis here. Yep, that's the function of the vagina, is pretty much insert penis here. Receives the male copulatory organ. Put penis here, put sperm in. Hopefully the sperm meets up with the egg. The next structure is the clitoris. That would be the female erectile tissue. It is anatomically very similar to the corpus spongiosum and the corpus cavernosum of the male, which is why it's in the same little color scheme there. No, there's not quite as much of the erectile tissue on the girl side of things, and there's missing an anatomy part to do interesting stuff with, but the clitoris would be the female erectile tissue. The last two structures would be the labia minora and the labia majora. The labia minora, minor, would be the small inner fold of tissue, or the lips. Yeah. The labia minora would be the small inner fold of pigmented tissue, whereas the labia majora would be the outermost bigger fold of tissue. The outer lips there? Yeah. The labia majora would be the more major of the two folds of tissue, and it would be the bigger outer fold. Labia minora, smaller fold of tissue on the inside. Really, they don't do that much for the reproductive system. They're just kind of structures there. On page 175, there are some questions. First of all, name the male and female gametes and the process to make each. We've already said that sperm is produced by spermatogenesis and that eggs are produced by oogenesis. I'm hoping you can tell that the sperm would be the boy parts and the eggs would be the girl parts. Yeah, I didn't label that, but the male gamete would be sperm and it's produced by spermatogenesis. The female gamete would be eggs and they're produced by oogenesis. Number 2, semen consists of sperm plus secretions from 4 reproductive structures. Name the structures. Somewhere in the lab book it does talk about the epididymis, the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the Cowper's gland. The epididymis, they never really say exactly what secretions it produces, but the seminal vesicles were adding the fructose, the prostate gland was adding the citrate, and the Cowper's gland, or bulbourethral gland, was adding the alkaline substances. Number 3, what's the function of the interstitial cells and where are they located? We said earlier the interstitial cells produce testosterone and they're found in the testes. You can go ahead and put in between the seminiferous tubules if you want. All I usually ask about is they're found in the testes. Number 4, which is larger, a sperm or an egg? Because we didn't really see them side by side, it might be a little hard to tell. But let me assure you the sperm is a lot smaller than the egg. Question was asking which is larger. Hope you circled egg there. The egg is actually quite a bit larger than the sperm. Which one is motile? What's a motile anyway? Which one moves? The sperm is the one that has the flagella and can actually swim through the female reproductive tract. The egg just kind of floats along there until it runs into a sperm. Number 5, can removal of the prostate gland cause sterility? Why or why not? Let's just say it shouldn't. The testes are still there. The interstitial cells are still there. There shouldn't be any problems. If you didn't need Viagra before the surgery, you shouldn't need Viagra after the surgery. Again, I do admit that if something goes wrong in the surgery and they slice into places they shouldn't have, that might cause some difficulties there. But assuming the surgery goes correctly, it should not cause sterility. Number 6, what part does the male urethra play in reproduction? The urethra does carry sperm. Wait, I thought it carried urine. It does carry urine, but the question asked what part does it play in reproduction, which is only carrying the sperm. If you want to put in parentheses and urine, that's fine, but the question was just asking about reproduction, so it just carries the sperm. Number 7, what part does the female urethra play in reproduction? Absolutely, positively nothing. Yeah, just put nothing down. That's fine. The female urethra only carries urine, but that was for the urinary system and not for the reproductive system. Number 8, what's the function of the endometrium? That's the one that's lost in menstruation. Really? That's the way you spell menstruation? Yeah, it doesn't spell quite the way it sounds or says or looks like it ought to be. The endometrium is the part that's lost in menstruation. Technically, it's lost after pregnancy as well, and it does thicken in preparation for pregnancy. But I can tell you that's never one of the choices on one of our lab practicals. Just concentrate on the lost in menstruation. Number 9, a Graafian follicle and a corpus luteum are usually about the same size under the microscope. What's the most obvious difference between the two? First of all, the black line is pointing to a Graafian follicle, and the blue line is pointing to the corpus luteum. So what's the difference between the two? The corpus luteum is empty. The Graafian follicle with the black line does have a round circle with a little round circle on the inside. The blue line points to the round circle without the oocyte on the inside. The corpus luteum, once the oocyte has been ovulated, it's empty. And number 9, it's empty. The corpus luteum is empty. Number 10, if each ovary normally selects one oocyte to reactivate approximately every 2 months, why do women have periods every month? Wait a minute, every 2 months? Why do we have periods every month? That's because we got 2 ovaries and they take turns. If the left ovary goes off this month and ovulates, next month it'll be the right ovary's turn. By the time you get back to the left ovary, it has been 2 months. The reason women have periods every month is because we've got 2 ovaries and they take turns. There are a few sorts of questions that I could ask on a quiz or on a lab practical later. On this slide, is this a Graafian follicle or a corpus luteum? It's a round thing with the round thing. It would be a Graafian follicle. I could ask if it's part of oogenesis or spermatogenesis. It's girl parts, so it's part of oogenesis. Could ask if it's part of girl parts or boy parts. It's still girl parts. Similarly, I could ask you to identify this slide. It's the seminiferous tubules. I could ask if it's part of spermatogenesis or oogenesis. That would be spermatogenesis. Thanks for playing. That's all I've got on the reproductive system.